So, without further ado, we have Casey Zimmerman with the department and Sarah Quiros with the Nebraska State Probation Administration Office. There you go.
All right. Thank you, Tara. So thank you for everybody who has hung in there for the 4 o'clock hour. We're the closers.
And we're going to close
I'm pretty sure all of your brains are full at this point. That was a lot of information for one day. So we're going to try and keep this a little lighthearted. If you have questions, please, let's just make this as interactive as possible as you guys end your day.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Ms. Zimmerman, is it true that you went to the best undergraduate university in the country?
Yes, it is.
Go Buffs.
Class of 91.
Wonderful. Okay, so what we're here today to talk about is really that interlink between probation and DHHS for our dually involved youth. We know that statute can be a little bit intermingling when it comes to really the responsibilities of juvenile court and who is doing what. And so today we're going to talk about really what our individual roles are within probation and within DHHS, what makes us separate, and then what do we do together.
Okay, so overall, our crossover youth or dually involved kids can have any of the kids that are adjudicated, maybe non-courts, things like that. Really our common ground is, though, we just want to make sure these kids are safe. We want to make sure that they have a good support system and that they have positive adults around, trusted adults, and also that we're giving them the skills between our two entities to move on and be productive adults. So I think the nice part about O'Neill is we've really established a good relationship with the district here and with the chief, and really respect the expertise of both entities. So we're just going to kind of go through and show you guys the differences that we play in this crossover team.
So with probation, our focus is really that delinquency, that community safety piece. And so as we mentioned before, we're not coming in and taking custody of youth. What we're doing is we're assessing for criminogenic risk, needs, and responsivity. I think we've heard a lot today about different things that kids are presenting with. So the disabilities, the mental illness, those things, those are responsivity issues. And so sometimes we have things that exist that kids are responding based off of responsivity that doesn't necessarily make their behavior criminogenic. And so we utilize evidence-based tools in order to really get to, is this a youth that's appropriate for probation? Or is this something that is medical, that is going to carry on for the rest of their life? And we need to connect them with the resources that are going to teach them how to adapt to that versus putting them in a juvenile justice system. The supervision of probation conditions are targeted through case management, specifically to reduce that criminogenic risk. So if we have a youth, for example, unfortunately this is very common. I'm sure that once I say this, you're going to be like, I know a kid like that. Is a youth that's on the autism spectrum, and they may get aggressive, and that is part of their disorder. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are a violent person. It just means they are responding to something that is medical within their body. And so that's where we have to really lean to say, is this criminogenic, or is this something, again, we need to connect them to the right resources as well as put plans in place to ensure that this youth has their needs met. And the focus is for the youth to remain in the family home. We know that prior to LB 561 in 2013, the high-risk youth were made state wards through the Office of Juvenile Services, and a lot of them were taken out of their homes. And we know that research tells us that that's not in the best interest of kids. We know that the research tells us that the outcomes are worse when we do that. And so we really try to utilize what they were talking about earlier, really what is that least restrictive environment that we're able to serve families with and put resources in place, because sometimes when kids have behaviors, it's the result of maybe parents that don't know how to respond to that, or they themselves don't have the coping strategies and they're modeling that behavior. And this way we can really help to the family unit versus just the individual youth.
And on the CFS side, we are going to be focusing on the safety, permanency, and well-being of the family. We complete our assessments, our safety and our risk, to kind of see where they're at. Are they safe? Are they unsafe? What are some of the areas we need to address? And then we look at the community services and the different resources we have and what can we put into that family to help them be successful. And also, we, like probation, want to do least restrictive. So we're always going to try to start with services in the home. And then if we're not able to maintain safety, then we will move the kid out of the home, maybe some services on both areas.
So to get a little bit deeper into, I don't think it changed.
There you go.
There we go. Just to kind of focus on what does this look like in practice? We utilize very similar terminology, and does it mean the same thing? So we're going to walk through a little bit of the more common things that we talk about, and talk about what are similar, what are differences. So the first thing is intake. So we hear a lot about intake, whether that's DHHS intake, juvenile intake for probation. And really for probation, juvenile intake means that law enforcement has contacted us saying that a youth has violated the law or that they have been located on a warrant, and they are asking us to screen them for detention. It is very, very specific in statute what juvenile intake stands for for probation. This is the only time that probation has any discretion to make a placement without a court order. And so we have been given that statutory authority that the police officer has temporary custody of a youth. They bring them to us. We screen for detention, and then the law enforcement officer who still has the youth in temporary custody then carries out probation's intake decision. That is the only time that we may make recommendations to the court, but outside of that, that is the only time that we would make that recommendation and follow through without that court order.
So some of these, like Sarah said, we really want to make sure as things are happening, you're clarifying, like, is this a probation thing, an HHS thing? Because intake and investigation and risk, all those things have just a little bit different definitions. So for the department, our intakes are always coming through the hotline. So they're screened through the hotline, and then they're coming out to us. They've been screened for abuse and neglect.
Okay, so investigation. So investigation for probation is what we call the predisposition investigation. And while we do have some addendums that we can put to that once post-adjudication or post-disposition, once the youth is actively on probation, to give updates to the court, really when we're talking about investigation, it is that predisposition phase to where we're trying to figure out what's going on. It's full family interviews. We utilize our risk assessment tool during that period. We're looking at any additional screenings that need to be done. We're looking at youth mental health, whether or not they're suicidal, needing immediate attention for something, or if it's really just digging into that family history to figure out what are the appropriate services that we would recommend for the judge to put in place that we feel that can address the information that we were able to locate during the predisposition investigation.
And for CFS, we're going to do an initial assessment. So our intakes come into us. We're going to do the initial assessments. We're going to screen a risk level and a safety level. And then we have about 30 days to then compile that investigation to come up with some conclusions. Now, if a child's unsafe, that's going to be shorter, but the assessment itself will be 30 days.
And for our risk needs tools, probation utilizes the Youth Level of Service 2.0 or the YLS 2.0. and it looks at that risk needs responsivity. So earlier I was talking about when we think about disabilities, when we think about mental health, and how that impacts some of the behaviors that kids have. Some of those things, those are responsivity needs versus risk needs. And it's really looking to see how do responsivity needs and how do risk intersect, and what does that youth need in order to improve.
And on our side, we're going to use a tool called structured decision making, and we look at about 16 different areas that we look at the level of risk, what's going on in order to decide where their strengths are, what their needs are, and what services we need to put in there.
Do we have any county attorneys in the room? So one other thing I want to say about the predisposition investigation is I know that especially the kind of the smaller the areas that we get into, the less likely we're going to see these ordered, because we know that, they take time. But coming from probation, it's something that we want people to order because it really helps us to narrow down what the youth's needs are in order to make those recommendations to the court. And it also makes the job easier for the judge because they have the story put together in front of them, and so they're really able to make an informed decision. So if you're a county that maybe doesn't utilize the predisposition investigation, I highly encourage you to think about how that could benefit and really make some jobs easier as we really target those interventions.
So we kind of showed you guys the different things we do, but together and separately, we do very similar things like family team meetings. We need to see the families. We need to see the youths. We're always having court reviews. We're always talking about placement. Sometimes that's something that our crossover kids, that's a staffing between both of us. Service provisions, and all of us are always reassessing. We're reassessing for safety, and you all are reassessing the case, reassessing community safety, where the kid is.
Absolutely. Okay, so I already spoke a little bit about this, but I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into probation's role at intake. So as I mentioned, really juvenile intake is initiated when law enforcement comes into contact with a youth that has either violated the law, perhaps they are runaway, or they have an outstanding warrant. There is specific criteria for detention, which talks about physical safety of persons in the community as well as the risk to flee the jurisdiction before they appear in court. So we utilize a risk assessment instrument, and again, this is required through statute in order to determine whether or not a youth meets that level of need for detention. And one thing we like to throw out there is detention, even though it is monitored through jail standards, it is very different than jail. And a youth can't be sentenced to detention. It really is a holding place for people to figure out what is going on with this youth and what do we need to do to safely transition them back into the community. And so while we may have youth that are on adult charges that are sitting in detention just based off of their age as they're waiting to process through adult court, that's a little bit different than maybe a juvenile that's on juvenile charges. And we really need to be exploring what else exists in our community that could also do those things that are not detention, because we know how harmful detention can be, especially if we're connecting low or moderate risk youth with some of those higher risk youth that potentially are in there for adult charges, and that all of those youth are intermingling while they're in there. So there are three intake screening options through the risk assessment instrument. The first one is to be able to release to the parent or guardian without restrictions. This is the only category through juvenile intake that would not require a detention hearing. The second one is we have a continuum of what we call alternatives to detention. This could be as simple as us sending the youth home with their parent with a curfew, or with an electronic monitor, or other things that are in place. It could also be a shelter placement, or a placement into an emergency foster home. And then, of course, we have the detention. And you'll notice that we didn't separate staff secure and secure detention, because if you've ever toured a detention facility, they're really the same. There isn't a whole lot of difference between what you'll see in a staff secure detention and what you'll see in a secure detention. So community-based aid, based aid dollars help to fund county continuums of detention alternatives. And every day probation, we're trying to come up with new and creative things, but we also need it to work for your communities. And we know that how fast detention alternatives, as well as use of detention, can drain county budgets. And probation, we really want to be partners in helping you to create some alternatives in your communities that will work for you, work for your youth, and help keep your communities safer.
Okay, so we talked about CFS role at intake. Our intakes either are going to come from law enforcement after hours or during hours, or from the hotline. And those usually that comes through law enforcement, we will just go out. The ones that come through hotline, they'll be screened for abuse and neglect. They try to get as much information as possible. And then as those are funneled to the local offices, they're given a priority. So we have 2 priorities. We have priority 1, which means we need to have contact with that victim within 24 hours. We have priority 2s that we have to have contact with the victim or victims within 5 days. Then from there, on both of the priorities within the next, really we'd like it as soon as possible, but you see the victims, and then you see the other children in the home, then you see the non-offending caregiver, and then the alleged perpetrator. So we look at all of those pieces, talk to all those people, and then from there we assess in the 30 days and make it a determination. Sometimes determinations can be made on that day 1 within the 24 hours that they're in a hold. They go court or non-court. We have some families that are doing alternative response also right now.
Okay, so now that we've kind of told you how we work separately and our individual roles, now we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when we have kids that are in both of our systems at the same time.
Okay, so we're just going to kind of give you a brief history. And we have, when we talked about the crossover youth practice model, we really wanted to look at what is going on with these kids. And I think as a state as a whole, well, probation started this along with RFK Children's Action Corps, and wanted to see what the research was on these kids. And what they kind of found out is these kids that are entered into both systems really become our most vulnerable kids. And it's hard to navigate these 2 systems because you have probation saying this, you have the department saying this. So they really wanted to see what can we do. So in 2010, they really started to focus on these studies and how could they positively impact this group of young kids. So all these folks got together. We have the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University. And through the Cross Youth Practice Model and the RFK Children's Action Corps, they started looking at dual status youth reform work. And when they looked at this, they collected all this information, and from all the information they collected from both of these youth, from both the systems and then the ones crossing, they decided that there is a lot going on with them. And so it was really just reinforced and provided more details on why this group of kids are tough kids. So what they really found is, like I said, they're our most vulnerable population. It's the challenge in information sharing and cross-system collaboration. So for all of you who have been here since 2018 when we rolled this out statewide, and there was a lot of, Tara, why can't you do this? And she'd say, Casey, why can't you do this? So just trying to figure out how we work together. These youth have been through the system of child abuse and neglect, so they had maybe a parent that was struggling with issues, and now they have some issues going on also. these kids tend to move deeper into the juvenile justice system, so they're not only going to maybe miss school, they're going to maybe steal something, they're going to maybe be violent. And in the end, anybody that works these crossover kids, you all know that these are our highest needs kids. They're our high-end service kids and our out-of-home placement high kids. These are the kids that we are sitting across from each other trying to figure out what to do with them. And also, when you look across the state of Nebraska, these are the highest rate of racial and ethnic disparity.
Well, and going to the point of the experience, the high-end services and out-of-home placement, you can go forward. When we really think about how long these kids have been system involved by the time that they come to probation, the things that they've experienced, whether it's trauma, whether it's moves, I'm sure most of us in the room have seen documentation and paperwork for kids as young as 5 and 6 going to PRTFs and facility institutionalized type settings. And so by the time that they're 11, 12, 13, 14, coming into that juvenile justice system, they have all of this lived experience that has to be taken into account. But sometimes when you say, oh, well, they've already had 3 PRTF placements, even though they're only 13 years old, where do you go from there when you are looking at, now they've broken the law, now they're in 2 systems, now we can't find a foster home, and the bar just keeps going higher and higher, options get lesser and lesser, even though we don't give up on kids. So when we think about what the nationwide data, this isn't Nebraska data, this is nationwide data, approximately half of the youth that are petitioned in juvenile court have at one time been involved with the child welfare system. And I have spent a lot of time looking at Nebraska data and a lot of our kids on probation. And I don't know that this data actually accounts for dually involved youth. I think that this might be dually adjudicated youth, or not necessarily adjudicated, but adjudicated at one time in both systems, not necessarily at the same time. But what about all those non-court cases that potentially have had closed, or alternative response cases that may not actually be counting towards that? It doesn't mean that we want them system involved. What it means is that we have to take into account when we're working with kids that they probably have significant trauma and things that are driving their behaviors that could very well be self-regulation oriented or based off of their triggers and their experiences, much that Lauren and Elizabeth were talking about earlier, that if we could have had services and things to address this at a very young age, and we get into that preventative lens and get ahead of this, we may be preventing further juvenile justice involvement.
And I think some of the things that we've discussed is right now we do a lot of sharing. So if probation has a youth, they call us, or they do a PDI, they call us and say, can you tell us a little bit about this kids? And I think what I'm learning as being the point person in Grand Island and Hastings is a lot of these kids do have this. They've been in the juvenile justice. They were out of home. Like I said, mom might have had drug and alcohol issues. There might have been domestic violence. And as we kind of look at these youth too, I think in my head, we've been training this all week. I wanted to step back and say, okay, we had those youth 10 years ago, and we were really helping mom with her drug and alcohol and domestic violence. And yes, the kids were out of home, but what skills did we put in there? What skills does the department need to look at to kind of help some of this data move a different way? So as we kind of talked, the dually involved youth had earlier, longer, and deeper contact with the child welfare system. So some of those youth I'm looking at that are in Sarah's system, they're 15 now, they were removed from the home at 1. So I mean, and then they went back home. So I mean, just a lot going on.
Well, I'm thinking about today, just today. And if you subtract privatization from 2023, and the ages of those youth that were impacted through privatization, and maybe some of our reaction to our out-of-home placement numbers are way too high. We got to get these kids back home. And while the intent was good, our implementation probably wasn't the best as a state. And as a result, those are a lot of the kids that we are also seeing coming back into our system, whether it be Casey's, ours, or both.
Yeah. So some of the data has shown us that the youth that experience worse outcomes than youth in the child welfare or juvenile justice, so they were in both, they are more likely to be homeless by the age of 21. They are more likely to be incarcerated as an adult, and they're more likely to receive public assistance before 21. So really our focus, we kind of in the beginning talked about, we want them safe, we want them to develop skills to be good, solid adults. So that's really the focus we're moving towards.
So earlier, Casey mentioned that there are significant racial and ethnic disparities, especially associated with our crossover population. And so if you look on the board here, census of white non-Hispanic youth is 86%. They make up 39% of our crossover population. Minority youth, census shows they're only about 14%. However, they make up 61% of our dually involved population. And so when we say that the disparities are significant, they are very significant. What we also show within the data for Nebraska is that we have about 71% of our dually involved youth that are placed out of the home, and we do have 29% that are able to remain in their home with services or reunification is in process.
So what are we trying to do? What do we want to do as crossover dual system youth design study early intervention? That's really something we want to move towards. We want to move towards more those kids that are having contact and are adjudicated. We have a lot of conversations with probation. We have, sometimes when they have a PDI and they know that the family has extensive history with us, we get on the phone, talk about what services they've had. How can we maybe keep, if that youth just needs to be on the probation side, how do we help them do that? Or if we look at these youth, I think the gentleman earlier from YRTC was talking about our kids with autism that are in YRTC. Do they need to be in the probation side? Do they need to be more suited in the department side? So really identifying those youth and what's necessary to really keep them out of the court system. We also are continuing to work on improved information sharing across both of our systems. We have a plan in place that the department has after-hour numbers, and you guys have after-hour numbers. We have those conversations. What's going on? This youth came in. If we're moving kids and they're one of ours and probation has to move them, we're having those conversations. So we're really trying to do that. Of course, there are those days where, you know, it may be, we'll call probation, we'll call the department. So up here, Tara and I, years and years ago on Casey Smith, we developed kind of a cheat sheet for law enforcement to say, if this is what's going on, call the department. If this is what's going on, call probation. We don't want these kids to get lost. We want to serve them. And where are they going to be best served? So that's some of the conversation we're having. We're still working on it. I would say it's much better than it was in 2018. We've come a long way. And so a lot of that communication and identifying those kids a little earlier has really helped. Mm-hmm. We're still working on alternative response. That's an informal, voluntary system, no allegations. So really trying to figure out how we can pull those in with the parents' consent to let probation know we're a part of them.
Yeah. And, you know, when we think about, I think a misnomer with dually adjudicated kids is sometimes people think, well, if we've got two systems, that means double the services and double the people, and that's a good thing, right? And it really isn't.
We got this.
And so dual involvement does not equal successful outcomes.
And we usually have the same services, really. I mean, there's a few that probation can access. that we cannot.
Yeah. So Nebraska efforts over the years, and so since the formal crossover initiative was launched, we have 5 sites. So the first one was Douglas County in Omaha. And then in 2015, Gage County, which is in Judicial District 1, Lancaster County, or the Lincoln area, and then Dodge County, which is in Judicial District 6, joined in 2015. And then Sarpy County, just outside of Omaha, joined in 2016. And then in 2018, a dual system youth policy was put together to where DHHS and probation came together and said, we have to memorialize what our practices are going to be and know that what your policy and protocols say matches what our policy and protocols say. And we also have to create a process for us to know that we're actually doing this and following through with this. And so that was done jointly through our office of the Administrative Office of the Courts and Probation, as well as with leadership with the Department of Health and Human Services. And currently, and some of you in the room may be involved in this, we are under a system review through probation with the Robert F. Kennedy Foundation to where they're really looking at all of our practices, all of our policies and protocols, everything that we're doing within probation to say, is it what's best for kids? Does this align with research? Is it evidence-based? And then giving us recommendations on how we can do our jobs better and knowing that we are aligning. And crossover youth was a big part of that as well. And we did receive some recommendations around that.
Okay, so how we as a community help with this, LB 1184s, we're talking about these kids. We're talking about them with the schools. We are really just trying to figure out where these kids are and what they need. And we continue to have our information sharing. We're doing those. I think up here you guys also have a school meeting that you kind of talk about those kids. So we're doing that, really trying to, there are some of the judges that give us an order that allows that conversation to happen between the two of us, and really continuing to address the current situation of these youth and of these families without having to have court involvement if court involvement is not needed. So really utilizing diversion. What kind of services can we put in there? Sometimes we have these youth that are maybe a PDI on probation side, and we have a non-court. We can do a service. We can do intensive family preservation. We can do family center treatment. So whatever we can do to keep those kids safely in the home. And if there comes a time that they cannot remain safely in the home, then we look at a filing and see where we need to go from there. Do you have anything else on that?
I don't. Okay. So we did a lot of talking. And when you put these presentations together, you just don't quite know. Are these the questions that people have? And so we wanted to leave some time for you to be able to ask us what you want to know. Boy, we were thorough.
Or if you all just want to say, it's 4:35. Go ahead.
I'm going to ask, just because I started working at the local health department in August, and I worked in prevention, substance use and alcohol among youth, and just so far everywhere that I've been, we serve 9 counties, but public health is not in there. And at least for me, for prevention, in my lived experience, like 11B, 1184, like how would I get involved in something like that? Because in prevention, it's like, that's me, how do I help, how do I get involved,
I think that's huge. So I'm with Lancaster. I live in Lancaster County, and prior to coming to probation, I was on 1184 teams, and we did have representation from like local health departments and prevention and things like that. And so I think that would definitely be something that you'd want to coordinate with your local
So the county attorneys, those are their meetings, and they really can invite whom they feel should be on that. So it's really reaching out to your county attorneys about those.
Anybody else? Okay, well, if you do have questions and you leave here,
Call
please,
Sarah.
yeah. I'm actually pinch hitting for Amy Latshaw today. I don't know if anybody knows Amy Latshaw, but she actually left for vacation in New York City today. So,
Yes.
but yes, if you have any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them, but I'll probably send you to Amy because she's really the expert, or you can contact Casey.
You can contact me. And thanks, Tara and Rod and whoever else put this together. You did a really nice job.
Yeah, it was a wonderful day.